Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it is time to do the week review for the second week of the 2023 USFL season. We had two matchups that were really highly anticipated that ended up being a bit different than what we expected, and a couple matchups that ended up being a lot closer than we thought they were going to be. So without further ado, let's just get right into the scores of the matchups. In terms of the first game, the Gamblers versus the Breakers, this ended up being a complete shootout at the end to literally everybody's surprise. The Breakers ended up winning this 38-31 to advance to 2-0. Then the Showboat Stallions game ended up being a 40-point destruction by the Stallions against the Showboats at Birmingham. And then on Sunday, we had the New Jersey Generals beat the Maulers in a game that was very close until the fourth quarter. And then the final game was the Panthers beating the Philadelphia Stars at a rainy Canton Stadium. So definitely a weird couple of matchups. So the first game between the Gamblers and Breakers, this game was essentially a weird one for a lot of people, I would say, because this game ended up looking in the first quarter like it'd be what you expected, which is two teams that aren't that good going against each other. But then after the second quarter, things started picking up. It eventually became that both teams were in basically a shootout where they just couldn't stop scoring, except when the Gamblers threw interceptions. Essentially, there were three interceptions that Kenji Bahar threw, and that basically cost him the game. Like I said in the Power Kings video, those three interceptions all came at terrible times when the Gamblers could have retaken the lead, and instead they ended up giving the Breakers extra points. So the Gamblers ended up losing that game due to turnovers, but their offense does look really solid, and as long as Bahar can get his turnovers under control, he legitimately looks like a solid quarterback. Then for the Showboat Stallions game, this was a complete destruction. Alex Magoo had an incredible game for the Stallions, who went 21 of 28, a 75 completion percentage for just over 300 yards with 4 touchdowns and a 149 quarterback rating. He out of nowhere is now one of the top quarterbacks in all spring football. And the thing is that this was a complete destruction in a way that shows that the Stallions are just a good team. Essentially, both teams had nearly the same amount of time of possession. If you're not over by like 6 minutes, you basically have the same amount, 32 minutes to 27 minutes, or nearly 28 minutes. And they both had the same amount of drives. It's just that the Stallions were able to get 463 yards on their 9 drives and an average 7.6 yards per play versus the 3.7 yards per play and 183 total yards the Showboats had. The Showboats only had 2 turnovers as well, so it's not even like they did a ton. And one of those Stallions drives ended up in a safety, so you can really say they got all those yards in just 8 drives, which is insane. Now, as for the Generals Maulers game, this game was totally winnable for either team heading into the fourth, but in the fourth, the Generals finally stepped it up and got a couple touchdowns, and the Maulers couldn't. This game was one where it was simply put the duality of quarterbacks. Both teams are running a 2 QB system. The difference is one of them is doing it by choice and the other is doing it because they have literally no quarterback. The Maulers quarterbacks played better than they did last week in week 1, yet they still played terribly. Williams was the better quarterback. He went 11 of 16 for nearly 70 completion percentage, but he only averaged 4.4 yards per attempt and he didn't throw a touchdown or a pick. Morgan did throw an interception and had even worse stats. So really, both quarterbacks looked pretty bad for the Maulers. Whereas Dakota Prukop fell off since last week. In this game, he only went for 50 completion percentage for 1 touchdown and averaged 4.5 yards per attempt. But he did have a better quarterback rating than Johnson, though I will say Johnson overall was a better quarterback. It's just that because of the touchdown that his quarterback rating went up. So the Generals quarterbacks did a lot better than the Maulers did. Both teams were without one of their 2 big running backs. So it was a very fair matchup, and the Generals ended up winning it in the end. The Generals should have won this a bit easier than they did, but it still is a good sign considering that Prukop didn't really play that well. Then for the last game, the Panthers versus Stars. This was a very rainy game. There's a lot of rain, moistness, wetness affected the ball. There was a lot of drops, a lot of, missed catches for both teams. There could have easily been like 7 interceptions in this game if it wasn't for how wet the ball was. Well, at the same time, that's why it caused almost a bunch of interceptions. Yeah, there were 6 total turnovers in this game, but the big difference was that the Stars had 2 fumbles that were lost, which are always a really, really big deal whenever a fumble is lost. Because when you look at their drives and time possession, they're even closer together than the Stallions were. Yes, the Panthers had one more drive, but their time of possession was literally less than 3 minutes. But the big difference was the running game. The Michigan Panthers ran the ball, and that's what won them the game. They had over 3 times as many rushing yards as the Stars. They had more attempts for better yards per rush and an extra touchdown. Even though they both had the same amount of total yards, basically, the Panthers being able to run the ball ended up being the difference. As in a rainy day like this, game was, you need to be able to have your ground game succeed. That's what ended up making the difference. That's why the Panthers won. As for the players of the week, we ended up having 3 guys win it that really weren't surprising. The first one was Alex Magoo. I mean, come on. Like I said, he had 300 yards passing for 75 completion percentage. If you do that, you're basically going to win player of the week in like any league, especially when you have 4 touchdowns and 0 interceptions for a 149 quarterback rating. The only thing that would have made his performance better is if he hadn't taken that sack at the end. And his 32 yards rushing were overall great as well. Essentially, this is arguably one of the best performances of spring football this year. Really, the only ones I can think were better were Josh Love's last week and AJ McCarron's this week. Aside from those, I would make a good case that this was the best one of all of them. So, as for Defensive Player of the Week, we had Frank Gidna of the Michigan Panthers, meaning the Panthers take home the award 2 weeks in a row. Gidna had a really solid game. It wasn't insane like Breland Speaks' was, but it was still solid. An interception, a pass defended, and 5 solo tackles for 10 total is overall pretty solid. Not too surprised he won it. Pretty cool to see the Panthers win it again, so definitely a good one. And then Special Teams Player of the Week, we had Anthony Ratliff Williams win it for the Gamblers. He had a great day receiving and returning. As for the receiving, which doesn't count to the Special Teams Player of the Week, he had 95 yards receiving on 4 receptions. That's an average of 23.8 yards per reception, with a touchdown as well. And his long was at 38, so it's not like he had, 170-yard bomb and that was it. He had an overall solid game. And then as for returning, he had 4 returns for 136 yards. That's an average of 34 yards per return, which is really, really solid. So even in the USFL where, you're always going to be returning kicks, that's still an insane mark to have. So overall, congratulations to all those guys for winning Players of the Week. Definitely deserved it. As for the attendance, there was only one real home game this week, and that was the Birmingham Stallions. Now, like I said last week, they're not having official numbers until probably next season when all the teams are in their hubs or in their actual stadiums. So we only see from eye test. But overall, I would say that Birmingham definitely was a disappointment. This was one of the cases where the USFL did not actually plan perfectly. I like to give the USFL a lot of credit for making, good decisions based on last year. But this was one of them that they didn't actually learn from the mistakes of the other league, just like the XFL didn't learn from the USFL's mistakes. Why do you have a Birmingham Stallions game at the same day as Alabama's Spring League game? Alabama Crimson Tide are like a religion in Alabama. Why did you have the game the same day as that? And it was the same day and same time, actually, as the Xfinity's Talladega race. So, this is a poor timed event. This is definitely not the, near 15,000 that last week had. Or this is like legitimately maybe 10,000. This was definitely a major disappointment from compared to last week and last season. But this is one that the USFL really did themselves. This was, I like to be fair both the USFL and XFL. This was some poor decision making by the league. There's no reason you should have had this game on this day, and that's a big reason why the attendance wasn't as good as it could have been. This game could have easily had much better attendance if this was at, the next day or, just not at Birmingham this day. But it was definitely a weird choice for having to be that day. So I think that overall the attendance isn't horrific, but it's definitely a disappointment. Now, the TV ratings. This is one where I think a lot of people, just like last week, are going to overreact. A lot of people looked at last week's ratings and said that the USFL, clearly won, but the XFL should be okay with it. I said that it was a overall decent showing that both leagues did what they should have done. This week, I say the same thing. I don't think either league is going to be too ecstatic. I think that XFL is going to look at their, ESPN2 game not having 400,000, despite the fact that it was a very important matchup, being a bit disappointing. And I think that USFL looking at USA having the lowest watched modern spring football game, that's dating back to 2019 AAF, is disappointing. But context matters for all these games. So the USA one, a lot of context is needed for that. That is a matchup a lot of people thought was going to be a bad, boring matchup instead of being the best game of the week, which it was for either league. So yeah, that's a big deal. And of course, it's week 2 of the season. It's not a big deal across the existence of the spring football. It might not matter at the end. Whereas the Orlando Guardians Battlehawks game did. The Battlehawks needed to win that game to stay in the playoff hunt, and to make it worse for the USFL, due to tiebreaker rules. The tiebreaker, if the Dragons had won their game the next day, meant that the Battlehawks needed to score as many points as possible and not allow the Guardians to score as many as possible, which meant that no matter what time in the game it was, it mattered. So that game mattered across the whole thing. So once it became a blowout, there was no reason to swap to the Breakers Gamblers game because you needed to see what the score was going to be. And to make it worse, that game started 30 minutes earlier than the Gamblers Breakers, meaning that the majority of spring football fans, which don't care if they're watching the XFL or USFL, they just want to watch football, are going to go to that game first because it's on first and keep it on. So that game having 760,000 viewers compared to the 130,000 viewers in the USFL, I don't think is as big a loss for the USFL as some people are saying, because the XFL should have won that. They're on ESPN versus USA. They have the Battlehawks playing at home, which is the most popular team in terms of stadium attendance and the most popular team in TV across both leagues. I don't think there's any loss there. Then, as for the over-the-air broadcast games, I think the USFL is overall okay with their ratings. Not as static. The bottom line is the actual rating got a point 0.5 for all three that were in broadcast across both leagues. But the fact is that the Showboat Stallions game became a blow up within the second quarter. The fact that that game had at 800,000 across its whole thing is insane to me. That shows that if that game was close, it could have had 900,000. And the Maulers Generals was a terrible game for the most part until the fourth quarter. There was basically no offense, just a couple plays that go to a field goal. So that game having 730,000, I think is pretty cool, because if that game was closer, it might have had 800,000. That was also a matchup not a lot of people were looking forward to. So, especially considering that the Defenders Brahmas game had playoff implications, yet only did 30,000 better. Even though, yes, it was in a worse time slot than, the 7 p.m. game on Fox. But the fact that it only did 100,000 better than the Generals Maulers the next day, I think that's a good sign for the USFL. That ABC game should have had better views because of the fact that that game had playoff implications. The Brahmas still could have made the playoffs. I think that's a big deal. And then, of course, the night game on Sunday, Vipers Dragons against the Panthers Stars. Again, those Dragons had the playoff implications. They needed to win, and then they needed to score as much as possible to win the tiebreaker. Whereas the Stars Panthers was a rainy game, which some people love the rainy weather games where, it's ugly football and some hate it. So that was usually a loss or benefit for the Panthers Stars, depending on how you look at it. So I don't think the USFL should be too upset. I think that people who are saying this is terrible are overreacting. Yes, would I have liked to see the USA number not be terrible, which it is? Yeah, but I can understand why it's terrible. You have two spring football games going on at the same time. One of them started earlier and has playoff implications on a better network with better, the better team in terms of fan appeal. Yeah, I'd expect that game to do better. You know what I mean? So I'm not really too upset about it. Overall, those are my thoughts on everything. This has been ZomFox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We have at least 3 videos coming out every single week during the USFL season. And this week we have 2 more coming out. We have the betting picks video coming out on Friday, and then tomorrow we're going to have the XFL 2023 regular season review come out. So be sure to be on the lookout for those. And as always, have a great night.